Welcome to Movies Recap channel. Today I will show you a 2007 American drama science fiction film directed by Richard Schenkman. It was written by Jerome Bixby. This film was the last screenplay by sci-fi legend Jerome Bixby, author of Twilight Zone, Star Trek, Fantastic Voyage, who finished it on his deathbed in 1998 with the aid of his son, Emerson. This film is an intriguing, at times daring meditation on the fleeting nature of the human condition, told from the perspective of someone who has quite literally seen it all. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and enjoy watching. The story opens with college history professor John Oldman, David Lee Smith, at his rustic home on the edge of a southwestern wilderness, packing his truck with moving boxes. His work is interrupted by an impromptu visit from his fellow faculty who want to see him off. We meet John's colleagues, quick-witted biologist Harry, John Billingsley, who is the life of any party, anthropologist Dan, Tony Todd, an astute observer with an insatiable curiosity, art history professor Edith, Ellen Crawford, a devout Christian, historian Sandy, Annika Peterson, who carries a torch for John, and arriving last on his motorcycle, is Art, William Catt, an archaeologist nursing a midlife crisis with the aid of student-turned-lover, Linda, Alexis Thorpe. John Oldman. So much for trying to just slip away. The group arrives with food and drinks for a going-away party. These are the people who've been John's friends for the last 10 years, and they're feeling a bit miffed that he is packed and leaving without so much as a goodbye. He apologizes to the group for his haste with a line about hating long goodbyes. Inviting them into his now sparsely furnished home, the group settles in, and they each begin their benign interrogations about John's abrupt departure. John tries the old line about getting itchy feet. None of them are buying it. Dan and Harry are concerned that John might be in some kind of legal trouble, despite his repeated assurances that isn't the case. Biologist Harry is about to meet one hell of a living specimen. With Harry's incessant teasing, Dan's deep curiosity, and the gentle prodding of his colleagues, John decides to tell them the truth, fully prepared that they'll not believe a word of it. Earlier Edith had noticed what appeared to be a genuine, unknown, Van Gogh piece casually stashed in the back of John's truck. Dan had found a prehistoric tool in John's house dating from Magdalenian prehistory. John tells Edith that the Van Gogh was given to him by Vincent van Gogh himself. He tells Dan that while the prehistoric artifact was merely a lucky find at a thrift store, but that he is old enough to have used it. The curiosity of the group turns to genuine concern for the mental well-being of their colleague, as John lays it all out for them. He is a 14,000-year-old man, dating from the Magdalenian era himself. He even knew the artist who made the famed prehistoric cave paintings of Lascaux in ancient France. The group is equal parts dubious, dismayed, curious and a bit angry. With a group that includes an anthropologist, an archaeologist, an historian and a biologist, the questions naturally begin to arise. John's friends aren't sure what to make of his revelation. Is he suffering some kind of detailed psychotic break from reality? Or is he just pulling their collective legs, answering very specific questions that test the limits of their various fields? There is something very disarming about the way John's answers unfold, a calmness and a clarity. It all rings true. When asked if he has awareness from his days as a caveman, he answers that his knowledge increased as humanity's collective knowledge increased. Many of the terms commonly used to describe prehistory today had no names or even definitions in his time. John's awareness of his own past is like the dim memory a child might have before learning to talk or read. One thing he was aware of early on is that he was different from all others around him. While others of his native tribe would age and die, he didn't. He reasoned that he stopped aging at around 35 or so, no calendars, no accurate timekeeping. For his own safety, he had to leave his tribe, who believed him to be some kind of energy vampire, draining their own lives to prolong his own. The origin of the vampire myth. One of John's guests proclaims excitedly. Harry learns the hard way there's no beating that caveman kung fu. After all, John's had 14,000 years of practice. Harry and Dan have the most fun with John's little game, not entirely convinced it's real, but finding John's nonchalant answers about his past increasingly fascinating. John casually notes that for the most part of his 14,000 years he's lived in obscurity, moving on every 10 years or so, as people would begin to notice he doesn't age. Questions arise about whether their host is somehow superhuman, with Harry testing John's reflexes by sneaking up from behind and grabbing him, only to be tossed on his back in seconds. No, John reiterates, he's not superhuman, just a regular man with 14,000 years of practice. Harry speculates perhaps John has a mutation which allows his cells to perfectly renew, without the usual defects which arise in cell duplication as we age. While the thought of a 14,000-year-old man sounds fantastic, Dan reasons, nothing about it is truly impossible. Sandy notices how John likes to remain close to the fireplace, and he states that he's always had a fireplace everywhere he's lived, something carried over from his days as a primitive that he can't seem to fully shake. When asked if he'd met any famous persons from history, John readily recounts stories of almost being on Columbus' crew, and other such brushes with history. He also mentions that around 500 BC he'd migrated east, spending time in India, where he met the wisest man he would ever meet, Gautama Buddha. John studied with the Buddha for some time, before his own nature once again forced him to move on. While Dan, Harry and Sandy are entranced with John's story, real or not, archaeologist Art begins to react with increasing indignation, assuming their friend is playing them for fools. Edith feels the same way, as if John is toying with their emotions by spinning this elaborate, impossible tale. When he's had enough, Art quietly goes off to make a phone call. With the mention of Buddha, a loaded question is asked that even John is afraid to answer. Has he ever been a famous figure in history himself? At first John quickly dodges, asking nervously if they could just skip to the next question. But Harry won't let him off the hook. John has come this far, he has to come clean with the rest. Reluctantly, John begins to tell a story of his time spent in the Middle East, around 2,000 years ago. Of the time he tried to bring some of the Buddha's teachings to a few willing students. As Dan notes, early Christianity was like Buddhism with a Hebrew accent. However, John's teachings ended badly, understatement. John's philosophies put him against the Roman government and the religious orthodoxy. Edith is mortified by the blasphemy of what John is suggesting, that he was the figure currently known as Jesus. John quickly counters Edith's charge by stating the whole concept of being a savior was not his idea. The savior title was given to him. On the matter of his resurrection, John averted the pain of his crucifixion by using meditation techniques he'd learned in India to slow his vitals and fake his death. His hands were bound to the cross, not nailed, so he was not mortally wounded, nails and blood made for more dramatic idolatry, however. Once inside his crypt, he awoke to slip away unobserved but didn't realize he was being watched. John's leaving sparked the resurrection story, and there you have it. As Harry laughingly observes, Jesus has been believed to be many things over the years: black, Asian, Caucasian, even an alien. Now it turns out he was a caveman. A deeply offended Edith wonders who else John will pretend to be next: Solomon? Elvis? Jack the Ripper? John tries to assuage Edith's outrage, but to no avail. She thinks the whole story is a cruel joke aimed at her deep-seated beliefs. She asks Harry to take her home, but Harry wants to hear more. Edith bitterly asks John if he just pulled the name Jesus out of a hat, and he tells her, convincingly, that his name has always been something sounding like John, but later Hebrew translations of his story use the name of Yahshua, aka Joshua, which eventually morphed into a later Latin translation as Jesus. The group is then met by a visitor, university psychologist Dr. Will Gruber, Richard Reilly, whom Art telephoned earlier. At first, a curious Will humors John by playing along with his story, wondering just how far John will go with his intricate delusional architecture before he admits it's all a hoax. Will's deconstruction of John's story takes on personal dimensions, as he asks if John was abandoned by his father, or if there is some other, more Freudian reasoning behind the elaborate tale he's told. John tells Will that he has no real memories of a father, only that there was a figure, perhaps an older brother, whom he dimly remembers. As the sun goes down and the house gets colder, the group gathers closer to the fireplace. The warmth of the fire's light reflects on their faces, as John's story takes on the spellbinding quality of a tale told around an ancient campfire. With his usual good humor, Harry deflates some of the tension in the room with a quick round of charades. Wordlessly mimicking a grunting, ape-like caveman, Harry pantomimes clubbing Sandra over the head and dragging her off. Playing along, John cheekily answers, "My first wedding?" The group laughs, while an increasingly sullen Edith is only more offended by the group's making light of John's sacrilege. "You are not Jesus," she repeatedly insists, deflecting what she takes to be an assault on her beliefs. Edith's hurt and anger is proof that the worst thing you can do to a person is destroy their God. Will then wonders what would happen if he took out his gun and shot this immortal man. Alarmed, John tries to defuse the irrational doctor's suggestion by stating that Will would be guilty of his murder. John never claimed to be invulnerable. Before Will can test his theory, he angrily storms off. Harry quietly tips John off to the fact that Will lost his wife to cancer only the previous day, hence his disposition. An empathetic John immediately dashes after Will, asking for his gun, worried that Will might be contemplating suicide. Resignedly, Will gives John the gun and drives off, embarrassed at himself for overreacting. Realizing it's all gone too far, the lights in the house come up, and John tells them it was all an elaborate hoax, a story designed to entertain and confound them, playing to their respective fields of anthropology, archaeology, biology and history. Edith is reduced to tears by the revelation and John humbly asks for their forgiveness. The group's bond is greater than their anger at being pranked, and they forgive him. With everyone calling it a night, John walks them outside as they each help him load a few more moving boxes into his truck. Before they leave, they each give John a hug and wish him well, wherever he's going. Even a tearful Edith forgives John, in the spirit of Christianity, of course. After everyone leaves, a contrite Will drives back to John's house, and asks for his forgiveness. The elderly, portly psychologist, who's in poor health, isn't taking the nighttime cold very well, and he goes inside for a moment. John remains outside with Sandy, who is in love with John and has remained curiously silent for most of the evening. With quiet candor, she tells John that she believes his story. She even notices that John currently uses a pun as his current last name, John Old Man. He smiles and tells her that he's often used puns as last names. There was a time he'd lived in Boston, where he adopted the name John Tea Party. As in, the Boston Tea Party. Will, walking back to the front doorway, overhears their conversation and begins quivering, his voice unsteady as he speaks at John with a new recognition. Will asks if John was the same John Party who abandoned his wife and young son in Boston many years ago. Will remembered his father having a beard, which he since shaved, of course. John immediately realizes that Dr. Will Gruber is, in fact, his young son Willie, whom he abandoned decades ago. He takes the crying older man's round face in a loving, paternal gesture, noticing that little Willie never liked the cold. As the old man sobs in his young father's arms, he is overcome both physically and emotionally. Will lets out a pained gasp as he suffers a fatal heart attack. Sandy quickly calls 911 and the paramedics soon arrive, but are too late. This is the first time in 14,000 years that John has seen one of his own children die. As the paramedics take his son's body away, a despondent John finishes packing and gets inside the truck, leaving Sandy standing in his driveway. They can't have really a future together, since he will outlive her, but he looks back and notices that she hasn't left, either. He stops the truck, taking a chance, and she gets inside. Note, while Sandy, Annika Peterson, is one of the least developed characters in the story, her unwavering devotion to John was clear long before he dropped his truth bombshell. She is also the only one in the group who accepted his story at face value, with no need for him to backtrack it for her, as he was forced to do for the others' benefit, particularly Edith. The duration of his future with Sandra is uncertain, and that's okay. Who knows exactly how long any couple has together, right? To quote Gaff, Edward James Olmos, at the end of 1982's Blade Runner, "It's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does?"